Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
When my parents handed my sister the keys to a house wrapped in a shiny red bow while the neighbors clapped like they were watching some kind of heartwarming commercial, I stood there holding a paper plate with a half-eaten hot dog and realized that I had finally become the background character in my own family story. The moment was loud, messy, celebratory, balloons tied to the porch railing, my mom tearing up as if Emily had just cured cancer, my dad slapping her fiancé on the back as though this was proof he had raised a genius, and I was left pressed against the fence, watching a scene I had no part in except as unpaid audience. That was the exact second something snapped inside me, not in the explosive way where you throw a plate across the room, but in the quiet, dangerous way where you simply know you're done. You have to understand, it wasn't the house itself, though the house was ridiculous. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a yard with enough space for Emily's future golden retriever, all paid for outright by my parents who claimed for years that money was always tight. It was the insult wrapped around the gift, the years of sacrifice erased with one gesture, the fact that they looked at me, their older daughter who had clawed her way through every bill, every medical emergency, every moment of being the responsible one, and still managed to smile, and they thought the appropriate thing to say was, "Don't worry, Rachel, your time will come." My time? My time had already come and gone while I was pulling double shifts at the hospital cafeteria to pay off student loans, while I wired money to them when the mortgage was behind, while I walked out of a clinic with stitches in my stomach and no one waiting to pick me up because Emily had borrowed the car again. The celebration went on with speeches and selfies, with my mother raising a glass of champagne to toast Emily's fresh start, while I sat in a fold-out chair that squeaked every time I shifted, balancing my paper plate like it was some metaphor for my position in this family, cheap, disposable, and meant to hold crumbs. A neighbor leaned over to me and whispered, "You must be so proud of your little sister," and I almost laughed, because proud wasn't anywhere near the word. What I felt was a kind of sharp clarity, like when you finally put on glasses and realize how blurry things had been for years. I looked at Emily twirling the new keys around her finger, her eyes gleaming not with gratitude but entitlement, and I thought, of course, this makes perfect sense. She has always been the golden child, the one they coddled and excused, the one who could wreck a car at 16 and still get another by 17, while I took the bus in the rain and heard lectures about responsibility. I tried to remember the last time anyone in that family had celebrated me with this kind of gusto. Maybe when I graduated college, though even that moment was swallowed whole by my parents saying, "It's a shame Emily couldn't focus like you. She could have had this too." Maybe when I bought my own tiny apartment with savings scraped together from years of skipping vacations and eating boxed macaroni, though they barely noticed, calling it temporary and reminding me not to get too comfortable. Every accomplishment I had was a footnote, while every mistake Emily made became a family mission to fix. Standing there at that so-called housewarming, I realized I had 2 choices. I could keep playing the role of dutiful daughter, nodding along as if fairness was irrelevant, or I could quietly remove myself from the script. And once that thought lodged in my chest, it didn't leave. I didn't make a scene, didn't throw my plate onto the lawn or scream about hypocrisy, though the temptation burned hot. Instead, I excused myself halfway through dessert, when my dad was lighting sparklers and Emily was pretending to cry from joy, and I walked to my car without saying goodbye. It wasn't a dramatic exit. Nobody even noticed until later. That was the cruelest truth. My absence barely registered. Driving home, I kept replaying the image of Emily's smug smile, my parents' glowing faces, and the realization that nothing I could ever do, no matter how hard I worked, no matter how many times I bailed them out, would ever make me their priority. The steering wheel felt like it was digging into my hands, and I laughed out loud. The kind of laugh that has no humor, because I finally got it. This wasn't about love or family or fairness. This was about roles assigned early on, and mine was never going to be upgraded. I was the backup plan, the safety net, the afterthought. I parked outside my apartment and sat there for a long time in the dark, watching the streetlights flicker, and I told myself something that felt both terrifying and liberating. That was the last family dinner I would ever attend as their daughter. From now on, I was done playing nice, done playing blind. They had given Emily a house. They had given me nothing. And that nothing was exactly what I was about to return to them, multiplied. I woke up the next morning with that heavy clarity still sitting on my chest like a stubborn house cat, the kind that knows exactly where to put its weight so you cannot breathe without thinking about it. And while the world outside my window was doing its best impression of normal, trash truck hissing down the alley, jogger with a neon visor tapping a rhythm on the sidewalk, coffee machine gurgling like it always does, I felt a strange steadiness settle in. Because once you see the machinery of your family with the cover taken off, with all the little belts and screws labeled favoritism and obligation and keep quiet for your sister, you cannot unsee it, and you cannot unknow how many times you have fed it with your time, your money, your silence. It would be cinematic to say I started packing a bag or drafting a manifesto, but what I actually did was open my budgeting spreadsheet, the one that has tracked every humiliating transfer and every temporary family loan since my 20s, and I scrolled through rows that looked like a polite crime scene, rent I covered when their tenant skipped out, a surprise dentist bill for my mother, 3 separate car repairs for my sister because the word maintenance apparently never survived the trip. From the glove compartment to her brain, a semester's worth of textbooks that somehow morphed into concert tickets and weekend trips after a small meltdown over stress, each entry with a little note to future me that said things like, "Do not forget this. Ask for repayment when things calm down. They promise to square up soon." Notes that now read like the diary of a very patient clown. I remembered the Thanksgiving when Emily announced between mouthfuls of marshmallow yams that she had wrecked the sedan and needed help with the deductible, and my parents turned to me as if they were assigning a task in a corporate meeting, their voices pleasantly managerial while they explained that the family would be grateful if I could handle it just this once because Emily was focusing on her career shift, and I thought about the Christmas when I paid off the last of their lingering credit card because the interest was just too ugly to look at, and how the thank you card arrived in March with a typed message so generic it might as well have been printed for a stranger, which, in retrospect, I suppose I was. I decided my first move would be quiet, effective, and instantly felt, because if there is one thing I have learned from years of being the emergency contact without the emergency respect, it is that people notice absence only when it interrupts their convenience, so I logged into the shared streaming accounts that I alone paid for and changed the passwords to something only a very motivated archaeologist could guess. Then I opened the autopay settings on the family phone plan and removed my card with the steady calm of a surgeon. Then I drafted a simple message to the group chat, no daggers, no drama, just a crisp line that read, "As of today, I will no longer be covering shared expenses. Please update your payment methods," and I hit send. Then turned the phone face down on the table like a dealer folding the hand, and for the first time in a long time, the silence that followed felt like relief instead of punishment. Predictably, my mother called within minutes with that high, injured tone she reserves for occasions when the maid forgets to read her mind, asking whether I had been hacked, whether something was wrong, whether I realized how difficult it would be for Emily to manage all this while planning her move, and I told her, in a voice so even it could have been used for meditation, that I was not hacked, that I was fine, that nothing was wrong except the part where everything had been wrong for years, and that it was time for them to handle their own bills since they had apparently discovered a treasure chest large enough to purchase a house with a yard big enough for a dog that does not yet exist. She tried the familiar script, the one about family sticking together and how we help each other in different ways, which is a charming philosophy when the distribution of help is not lopsided enough to tip a building. And I said that my help would now look like boundaries and my love would now look like distance, and I could hear her swallow, could practically hear her searching for my father in the background to stage manage a response, and then texted one of those full paragraph apologies that reads like it was assembled from inspirational quotes and customer service phrases, and I realized with an odd little smile that I was not even angry, I was simply finished. I spent the afternoon doing the kinds of errands that make a life feel solid, laundry folded into dignified stacks, fridge cleared of ghost condiments, files sorted into neat folders like a paper spine, and while I worked I let my mind wander through the small, Unglamorous humiliations I had absorbed without protest. The time Emily used my emergency fund to buy flights to a music festival because she needed joy to survive. The day my parents used my professional reference as leverage to get Emily an interview she did not prepare for. The summer I moved them out of their storage unit by myself because nobody's back could handle lifting except mine. All of it piled into a quiet mountain that only I had ever had to climb. When the sun slanted low and the apartment filled with that warm, forgiving light that makes even the dust look intentional, I sat down with a cup of tea and tried to rehearse the conversation I knew would come, the plea, the guilt. The rewrite of history in which the house was not a house, but a necessity, in which my sacrifices were not sacrifices but choices, in which the responsible daughter should congratulate and comply, and somewhere between imagining my father's shrug and Emily's tears. A different picture presented itself with elegant simplicity. I did not have to argue at all, because arguing would simply feed the machine I had just unplugged, and if I wanted change that would last longer than a week, I needed someone who would speak for me without flinching and with documents instead of feelings. So I opened my laptop, the same faithful rectangle that has held my resume and my tax returns and, apparently, my tolerance, and I typed a slow, careful phrase into the search bar. A phrase that felt both outrageous and perfectly reasonable after a lifetime of being reasonable to my own detriment, and as the results loaded names, reviews, specialties, a map of offices sprinkled across the city like little promises. I felt a steadiness I had not felt since childhood settle into my bones because if they preferred transactions to relationships, then transactions they would get, and if they wanted to pretend my help never happened, then paper could introduce them to the truth. The phone buzzed again with a fresh chorus of demands and apologies and advisories about keeping the family out of public messes, but I let it sing to itself on the table while I clicked a listing with the quiet confidence of someone choosing a locksmith at midnight. And as the calendar page popped up and the available slots stared back at me like open doors, I picked one for the end of the week, entered my name, attached my tidy folder of receipts and messages and bank statements, and pressed confirm, after which I closed the laptop, exhaled a long breath that did not tremble, and finally allowed myself a small, unladylike grin at the thought that I had just committed the pettiest and most principled act of my life by turning every unpaid favor into a line item with a case number to match. The appointment with the lawyer was set for Friday afternoon, and the days leading up to it stretched out with a kind of brittle silence that felt both dangerous and thrilling. Because for the first time in my life, I was not rehearsing apologies or strategies to keep the family calm. I was simply letting the air stay charged, letting their unanswered calls pile up like junk mail, and watching their texts shift from bewildered politeness to thinly veiled irritation, as though I had broken some unspoken contract by refusing to be their safety net. I knew my mother would frame it as me having a phase, and my father would talk about loyalty, while Emily would do her usual performance of fragile victimhood, but for once none of those narratives mattered, because I had a folder in my bag filled with documents that proved my memory was not hysterical, not exaggerated, not biased. It was a paper trail, neat and merciless, each receipt and transfer sitting there like an unimpeachable witness, waiting to be sworn in. The lawyer's office was not glamorous the way I half expected. No marble floors or intimidating glass walls, just a converted townhouse with creaky stairs and the smell of old wood polish, which somehow made me trust it more. Because I did not want someone who performed power, I wanted someone who practiced it. Mr. Daniels was older than I had pictured, with tired but alert eyes and a way of listening that made silence feel comfortable instead of awkward. I slid the folder across the desk and told him the short version. Parents bought my sister a house, gave me nothing, years of lopsided support, promises never fulfilled, a pattern of exploitation dressed up as family duty. He did not raise an eyebrow or smirk at the drama. He just opened the folder, leafed through the bank transfers, the text messages where my parents had actually written things like, "We'll make it right for you when the time comes," and he nodded slowly, tapping a pen against the edge of the desk. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost conversational, but every word felt like a key turning in a locked door. He explained that while family disputes were messy and rarely simple, the presence of clear financial contributions and written promises changed the terrain. This was no longer about whether they had been fair in spirit, but whether they had created obligations in fact. He pointed to the notes where I had covered their mortgage arrears, to the wiring slips that carried not small change, but thousands of dollars at moments when my own life had been fragile, and he told me that any judge would recognize those as legitimate debts, especially since there had been no repayment. He even chuckled lightly when he read one of my father's texts about investing in your sister's stability first, then yours, shaking his head as if to say, some people really cannot hear themselves. I had walked into that office expecting to feel foolish, half convinced that I would be told to grow up and let it go, but instead I felt something expand in my chest, something like relief but heavier. As though years of being gaslit about fairness were finally being counterbalanced by a stranger saying, yes, you were right, this was wrong, and it is not only emotional but actionable. The tears that slipped out then were not fragile but fierce, and I laughed while wiping them because the irony of crying in front of a lawyer felt like the punchline to my entire family dynamic. Mr. Daniels did not flinch. He simply pushed a box of tissues toward me and said, that happens more often than you'd think. When he slid the retainer agreement across the desk, it looked almost ceremonial, as though this was not just a contract for legal services, but a document declaring my independence. A pledge that I would no longer let my parents write the story of what I owed and what I deserved. My hand did not even tremble as I signed, and when I set the pen down I felt a strange calm, like the kind of quiet that comes after a storm when you realize your house is still standing, but the landscape has changed forever. Walking out into the late afternoon sun, I half expected the city to look different, to mirror the shift that had just happened inside me, but of course the streets bustled with the same indifference, people carrying coffee cups and shopping bags, taxis honking as though the universe had not just tilted. Yet to me everything had sharpened. The noise felt crisper, the air cooler, even the ground firmer under my shoes. I kept picturing Emily's face when the first letter from the lawyer arrived, her confusion when she realized this time I would not be the one cleaning up the mess, and I wondered how long it would take before she tried to spin it into another tale of my cruelty. I reached my apartment and placed the signed copy of the retainer in my desk drawer, closing it with a sense of finality, and I stood there for a long time thinking about how easy it would be to backslide, to answer their calls, to let their guilt seep back in like water under a door. But I also thought about that house with the red bow, about the way they all looked through me as though I were just part of the scenery, and I knew I could not return to that role. From this point forward, my silence would not be submission, it would be strategy, and my words would arrive not in heated phone calls, but on legal letterhead signed by someone who understood that debt is debt, even when it hides inside a family portrait. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the hum of traffic, I repeated a single sentence in my head like a vow, let the lawyer do the talking. It was both terrifying and liberating, a surrender of control that was not weakness, but strength, because for once the burden was not mine to carry alone, and the reckoning that was coming would not be a shouting match in a living room but a cold, structured conversation in a place where fairness was not optional. The letters went out on a Tuesday morning with the kind of tidy finality that makes printers sound like little metronomes of consequence. And, because Mr. Daniels preferred old-fashioned ceremony to email, he sent them certified and return receipt requested, which meant that while I made coffee and answered work emails and tried to remember if I had any clean socks left, there were green cards traveling through the postal system toward my parents' mailbox and toward Emily's new front porch cards. That would require a signature and, more importantly, would leave proof that the message had arrived, that the era of me absorbing every imbalance with a tight smile had formally concluded, and that from now on any conversation about fairness would run on a track laid in ink rather than tears. The silence I kept after that was not the brittle kind that cracks with the first apology, but the deliberate kind that settles into the bones and changes how you walk. because I no longer carried the twitchy urge to pick up every call or to explain myself in paragraphs that felt reasonable to me and accusatory to them. And when my phone lit up with my mother's name followed by a chain of question marks, I let it go dark again. And when my father wrote a single sentence about loyalty that sounded like a command more than a memory, I archived it without flinching, and when Emily sent a voice note with theatrically shaky breathing, I deleted it unheard, since I had finally accepted that the performance was the point and I was done paying for tickets. Predictably, the story began to travel without me, first in the family group chat where my aunt, who regards gossip as both sport and charity, typed that she had heard something odd about Rachel acting out, then in the church circle where my mother, apparently armed with the holy language of forgiveness weaponized as public relations, told people that I was under stress and making rash decisions, and finally in the neighborhood where my father, who has always loved an audience almost as much as he loves a lesson, suggested to anyone within earshot that I was trying to punish them for being generous to my sister. A narrative so neat and self-serving it could have been cut from a pamphlet titled How to Bury Decades of Favoritism in a Single Sentence. I could have ignored it and let the rumors rot on the vine, but my version of silence had never meant surrender, so I picked a single point of leverage and pressed until it clicked, which in this case involved forwarding to my aunt. Not the whole spreadsheet and not the text messages, because I am not a pyromaniac and I had no desire to burn the house down, just one concise PDF that listed 3 large transfers with dates and their stated purposes, alongside the screenshot of my father's cheerful promise that we'll make this right for you when the time comes, accompanied by a polite note saying I was fine, I loved everyone, and I was simply asking to be treated like the adult they always told me I was, at which point my aunt, whose conscience is as efficient as her tongue, replied with a row of ellipses, and then went mysteriously quiet, and 2 hours later the neighborhood chorus died mid-verse, because its conductor had apparently misplaced her baton. Meanwhile, the practical side of revenge, which to me has always been less about spectacle and more about returning ownership of my time and credit to the person who earned them, unfolded with the kind of satisfaction usually reserved for people who iron clothes perfectly. Because I called the bank and removed Emily as an authorized user from the card I had added her to years ago during one of those optimistic phases when I believed that helping her build credit would someday translate into competence, and I learned, with a small, private wince of vindication, that the moment my request processed a furniture purchase she was attempting for her new living room declined at the register, which forced her to use the house money for the couch instead of using my credit like an invisible subsidy. A tiny correction that no judge would ever see yet felt like a piece of gravity returning to its rightful place. I also filed the most boring and therefore most powerful paperwork I could think of, which included freezing my credit to prevent any accidental, hard pulls connected to family ventures I had never agreed to, removing my name as emergency contact from the family doctor so that the next urgent call would go to the generous adults who had claimed all the decision-making power, and sending a calm, carefully worded email to the pastor who had tried to schedule a surprise reconciliation meeting without my consent, explaining that my faith did not require me to fund other people's priorities, and that any conversation about forgiveness would happen after restitution, not instead of it, which, judging by the speed with which that calendar invite vanished, landed with the moral clarity it deserved. The green cards from the post office found their destinations by Thursday, and the shift in tone arrived like weather. My mother's texts changed from pleading to legalistic. My father stopped invoking loyalty and started invoking the will as though dangling a future exclusion could retroactively balance a past ledger, and Emily sent me a picture of her with a dog that did not yet have a name, presumably to stage a humanizing tableau where I was the villain who hated happiness, which would have been more effective if the dog had not looked exactly like a rental prop, eyes wide, collar tag, still blink. Late that night, while I sat at my kitchen table with a bowl of late pasta and the soft thunder of distant traffic in my windows, Mr. Daniels called with the kind of dry humor that makes bad news digestible, and said that my parents had retained counsel who opened with a predictably huffy letter calling my claims misunderstandings, yet had tucked into the final paragraph a suggestion about exploring an amicable settlement, which is legal music for we would prefer not to air this on a public stage, and he asked how I wanted to proceed, to which I answered that I wanted the number to start with acknowledgement and end with repayment plus fees, and that I would not accept a settlement that reframed my help as charity or required me to sign an apology to anyone. We agreed to send a firm but mathematically polite counter by morning, and just as I hung up, feeling that quiet fatigue that comes from doing grown-up things well, there was a knock at my door, a slow, patient rhythm that did not sound like a neighbor or a delivery. And when I looked through the peephole, I saw Emily standing in the hall with a cardboard box I recognized from the housewarming, the red bow drooping over one corner like it had lost interest, her face set in that peculiar blend of entitlement and desperation that always precedes a very expensive request, and as I unlatched the door I told myself to keep my voice even, because nothing matters more than letting the lawyer do the talking, except, perhaps, deciding whether I will even let her speak. Emily stood in the doorway with the box tilting in her arms and a look that wanted to be wounded, but could not quite conceal the calculation beneath it. And while the hallway air smelled like someone else's dinner and the old elevator groaned through the floors like a tired animal, she launched into a speech about sisterhood and misunderstandings and the tragedy of legal letters showing up like rain on a holiday, insisting that if I would just sit with her and listen we could sort this out, without dragging everyone's names through places where strangers took notes. Yet, even as she spoke, I noticed the corner of an envelope tucked under the ribbon, a thin rectangle with my name on it in our mother's careful penmanship, and I realized, with the odd calm that comes from recognizing a magician's trick mid-performance, that she had not come to reconcile, but to deliver a new script in which I was expected to feel guilty before I had even opened the prop. I let her in because I wanted no later claim that I had refused conversation, and I set the box on the table where the ribbon puddled like a wilted flower while she paced my tiny kitchen and talked about stress and optics and the way neighbors gossip, explaining that lawyers could be avoided if I would acknowledge that the house had not been a reward but a stabilizing move, and that of course they had intended to do something similar for me when the timing was right, which would have been more convincing had it not echoed the exact phrasing captured in the texts now filed in a neat binder under the heading Promises. So I asked her to sit, poured water into 2 mismatched glasses, and slid the envelope out from under the ribbon, because if there was to be theater, it might as well proceed to its reveal. Inside lay a letter that managed to be both contrite and accusatory, a careful apology for my feelings followed by a request that I withdraw the formal action for the sake of family dignity, wrapped around a cashier's check made out to me for an amount that would have looked generous to anyone who did not know the ledger, and a tidy agreement, already signed by my parents, that declared the payment full settlement of all debts past and present, complete with a line for my signature and a clause requesting that I refrain from further negative characterization of events, an artful piece of stationery that smelled faintly of a notary and strongly of erasure, and when I looked up I found Emily watching my face like a gambler reading the table, her eyes already wet as if tears might tip the scales where numbers could not. I did not raise my voice or deliver a moral sermon, because the point of truth is not volume. So I tucked the letter back into the envelope and told her in a tone that could have narrated a weather report that while I appreciated the sudden rediscovery of arithmetic, the sum did not approach the total of my documented contributions, nor did it account for legal fees, that I would not sign a document calling reality a misunderstanding just to make holidays more photogenic, and that if they wished to treat this as a transaction, then the appropriate venue remained the one with fluorescent lights and microphones where promises are read aloud to people who get paid to remember them, at which point she switched, like a professional, from pleading to indignant, announcing that I had lost sight of what matters and that I was risking our parents' health, and when that did not budge me she tried the memory of childhood secrets, the kind you are supposed to protect forever, but the spell had broken months ago, and the secrets were simply facts without leverage. The court date arrived in late autumn when the daylight thins early and every jacket pocket begins to collect receipts and old mints, and the courtroom looked exactly as inelegant as I had imagined. with wood benches that punished fidgeting and a clock that seemed to have been designed to stretch minutes into noodles, yet the language that unfolded there had a clean, stern beauty I had not expected, because when Mr. Daniels laid out the transfers, the dates, the texts, and the pattern, he did it with a restraint that turned my years of quiet into a single coherent argument, and when my parents' attorney tried to reframe my help as spontaneous generosity unconnected to any expectation, the judge interrupted to ask the kind of plain question that makes everyone sit still. If there was no expectation of repayment, why had the parents written that repayment would come when the time was right? And in the measured silence that followed, I felt something unclenched deep in my shoulders that had lived there since my 20s. We did not reach a cinematic verdict complete with gavel thunder and speeches, because life prefers stipulations to climaxes, but by late afternoon both counsels returned from the hallway with a settlement that felt almost obscene in its simplicity. Repayment of the documented amounts with interest, coverage of my legal fees, removal of my name from any accounts or authorizations I had not personally initiated, and a statement acknowledging my contributions without the euphemisms that had attempted to bury them, and when the judge asked if I agreed, I said yes, with a steadiness that felt like crossing a bridge and stepping onto solid rock. While across the aisle my mother stared at the table as if willing the wood to open, and my father rearranged his papers with the precise movements of a man lining up disappointment so that it looks like control. Outside the courthouse the air smelled like cold metal, and the sky had that bruised shade that arrives before evening, and Mr. Daniels shook my hand with a small smile that said both congratulations and welcome to the boring miracle of paperwork with teeth, then left me alone on the steps where Emily waited with her coat collar pulled up and her chin set like a question, asking if I was happy now that I had won, and I told her that what I felt was not happiness, but relief braided with grief. Because money can pay back numbers but not years, and because even justice, when it finally shows up with its careful clipboard, cannot refill the quiet places inside you that learn to stay small to keep the peace. And she looked at me in a way that suggested she might hear that sentence later when the apartment is dark and the dog finally sleeps, though I did not place a bet on it. In the weeks that followed there were changes that registered less like fireworks and more like weather, the transfers arriving on schedule, the credit reports clean, the group chat silent except for the occasional forwarded recipe from an aunt who refuses to surrender hope, the pastor passing me with a nod that held neither pressure nor pity, and I moved through my days with a steadier gait, cooking for one without apologizing to the empty chair, paying bills that belonged to me and only me, and letting the phone ring to voicemail when the number had the familiar area code of obligation, yet on some evenings, usually the mild ones when a breeze through the window rearranges the curtains like a hand smoothing a page, I would think about the letter in the envelope with the cashier's check and the line I had not signed, and I would wonder, with a curiosity that did not hurt, whether there exists a version of our family where the house would have been a celebration instead of a sentence, where I could have stayed and clapped without counting, and whether the truth I refuse to ignore will remain a wedge forever or carve out, years from now when pride has tired itself out, a small doorway where someone might knock without a prop and say a plain sentence that asks nothing in return.